What happened was I was friends with Dick Howe on Facebook, and he enjoyed my photographs. And then he asked me to contribute to his blog. And I got into that on it was almost like a visual diary, where something from my day-to-day life, I would find it and put it up. But there was also a sort of, there were like very narrow windows of when I could actually take photographs, because I work a lot. And it would often be when I was going from one place to the other, or one meeting to another meeting. So there was like a certain pressure, or, I got to take something now or else I won't have time later.
Photographs created for the Lowell blog were of such things as ironwork, architectural details, and signage, captured during my on-foot wanderings of the city. This attention to everyday items bears comparison to the notion of the post-industrial character of the flaneur, as derived from Baudelaire by Walter Benjamin. The flaneur is a casual idler, a browser who engages in collecting impressions and examining common objects and ideas. A recurrent comment on these photographs was that they drew attention to things that people have passed by many times without noticing. It was also remarked that the work made the too familiar visible.
One of the reasons that I use just a single object is to give it that aura, that, I wouldn't want to say worshipful, but, or even fetish. It becomes the center, whereas if you have, and there is an example of something where I have a lot of objects, but I think I was getting back to the old figure and ground relationship of a thing being in a space, and I don't know if this applies to everybody, but when I look at a photograph or a painting, one of my instincts is to put myself into the picture, and with one single object, that's probably lends itself more to that.
Thomas Demand has observed that when objects are photographed together, the viewer instinctively imagines a narrative of how these things might interact with each other. In light of this dynamic, I have chosen to limit the conversation between a single object and the scene within which it is placed.
I needed to get some kind of second master's degree to advance my career. I chose photography because it had become a passion, and it wasn't really a master's degree in photography. It's a master's degree in visual arts.
With my start in the LUCAD program in 2015 came the metaphorical childhood's end of my impression-driven, picturesque approach to photography. I began to see that concept must take precedent over artifact, understanding that my role as a practitioner of ideas needed to come before photography as a tool of expression.
Getting into photography and trying to address some of my other interests, like archives, books, the world of ideas, to put it in a really broad way. I'm interested in the world of ideas.
My motifs included the depiction of fragmentation through framing, netherworld spaces devoid of human presence, the endeavor of collecting, and tableau photography, as well as redacted and blocked imagery. Consciously cataloging the various directions was the initial step in devising an approach to unifying them. I would describe the idea of the netherworld as a realm that is neither day nor night, where the curtains are drawn but not to the effect of full darkness, and consciousness engages with the prospect of oblivion. Pursuing this idea, I studied the lighting techniques used in film noir and chiaroscuro painting.
I used to have an attic studio on Wilder Street, like a garret, and I dreamed of being, the next great painter, and it ended at some point. But when I was studying it, I learned about composition and framing a scene. Another thing that taught me how to frame was that I was the editor of my high school yearbook, and I wound up finishing the yearbook on my own. Everybody kind of disappeared right at the deadline. But one of the things I learned, that you can take a certain photograph if you crop it, we had a cropping tool, and you can, the variety of effects you could get by the way you cropped it was really powerful. You could make somebody see what you wanted them to see by the way you cropped it. You could tilt it, you could do all kinds of, just within that, we had a, it was like a, it was like a tool that opened up and closed, and so I think I'm still doing that, but I'm doing it by going forward or coming back or turning. I think that had a big effect on how I see a scene. And of course, I love cinema, and I'm always paying attention to how the director frames something. So I think that any great director is also, in a way, a painter. I look at things from my own angle, my own sort of strange angle, and part of what I see is what I'm looking away from. It's like a removal. If you haven't noticed, there aren't too many people in my photographs. In the one of the Topico restaurant, if you look very closely, you can see some people talking, but there's also, along with them, there's a poster of Malcolm X, and they could just as well be the poster of Malcolm X. They kind of become part of the object, the way it's done. The larger pieces are specifically they're items that I created for my thesis. That the thesis was basically to create a set of rules and stand by them. And for the thesis work, I stuck with verticality, because verticality is kind of a way to redact or limit a more the cinemascope kind of view of like the full landscape. This kind of narrows it so that you're kind of scanning up and down. Years ago, I was cleaning up an estate for my uncle, and I found this jar that I liked. And I didn't know why I would keep it, but I kept it. And at some point, I decided to meld it with, put that jar in front of a 35-cent print that I got at the National Gallery. And by putting those two things together, I've created a new space. And that's really kind of a departure from walking around on your 2 feet, whether you're in Quebec or Lowell or Scotland, which is where some of the photographs were taken. You're creating a new place, a new country, a new area, and that area is sort of like ideas,
While the classic figure-ground relationship is in play, the connection between the two elements that most concerns me is conceptual. A figure finds its ground through the consideration of how these things might relate to each other, and by experimenting with different variations and resonances. For the central object of the tableaus, I select from a collection of oddments, such things as containment vessels or metal objects. For the ground, I enlist art prints, photographs, the end papers of old books, and as with Cornell, texts and maps.
When I was in New York and I was waiting for my train, I saw that there was this gigantic or huge painting of Pope Francis on the side of a building. And where I was standing, the American flag started to block him out. So I stood there, and I knew that I wanted I knew what the objective was. It was it's a device that Magritte, the painter Magritte, uses, where like an apple will block a man's face, or a hat, or a bird will fly by and cross something out. There's this sort of like things I discovered by staying in my studio and working with objects that were available, and there were things I discovered out in the world, and then one starts to influence the other. There was an old law book up in the attic, or the second floor of the Center for Lowell History, where the binding had burst open, and these are very arid books about law from the 1880s, I believe, and the fact that the binding would break open and reveal musical notes, because they used to pad the insides of bindings with whatever scrap paper they had around. So you've got the rule of law, that, you know, who's going to read that stuff, and then the binding breaks open, the leather gets old and dries and breaks open, and the music comes out. I couldn't resist it. There's a tendency towards symmetry. You know, you want to center things and have, you know, something on both sides of the equation. But when I become conscious of that, sometimes I try to consciously steer away from it. One of the techniques or approaches I got into was, instead of shooting right at the object, but was to shoot between things. You know, find the negative space. You can see that in the it's a ruin of a castle in Scotland, and it's basically two walls of the castle. And I could have picked a wall, but I decided to shoot the void.
I continue to employ the vertical element that divides or blocks other imagery, be it an apothecary jar blocking a Vermeer, a flagpole bisecting a mural of Pope Francis, or a chrome shaft redacting the signature on a painting as it intrudes upon a harpooner at his work. These redactive gestures, carried out through framing and sectioning the world, circle back to my profession as an archivist. This rule-based discipline that I have sought to distance myself from ultimately exercises its hold as the urge to save engages with the need to destroy or efface. Time will tell how effectively I will engage rules and systems, both externally imposed and consciously chosen, in order to arrive at a destination somewhere between the exacting and the uncertain.